phone camera's a little greasy, but I don't care. You're gonna get what I give you. So that house is fucked up. Okay. Couldn't figure out what kind of light this was for a second. I need some sleep. Anyway, so got thinking about some stuff in regards to playable races and stuff, and especially how recently, in most of the recent books, a lot of player races, instead of having like more specific information about like how long this particular species lives, it usually, like the grand majority of them, just say about a century. So what that really means is about the same as human. So there's like human lifespan, but then they didn't change it for elves, dwarves, and gnomes, and like some of the more longer lived races. They still get to live for centuries. And some other discussion kind of related was how some people find it really dissatisfying, and they usually ban those longer lived races because they feel like their players can't represent a very long-lived race effectively. And first to that, I have to say, the fuck? Why? Do you know, have you met a person that has lived for 600 years and you know how they are? No, you haven't. Relax. Now, of course, skate your own table, do whatever the fuck you want. If you want to focus on more short-lived races and leave those long-lived races as kind of specific, use them as more alien NPCs, that's fine. But it got me thinking about like the differences between more short-lived and versus long-lived races, and like effectively what really happens most of the time. What does that mean? What does that look like? And I came to a few conclusions while standing in the shower. So first, one, there's a lot of different ways you could do it. And so first you have to explain, like, okay, if these races don't live, or these races live way longer, why don't they rule the fucking world? If they're like basically human in a lot of physical ways, maybe some more magic or whatever, but they live longer, why don't they rule the world? And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But a really popular one I see is they reproduce way slower. Like, say, an elf that lives 700 years might still only have 2 to 3 children over the course of their entire life. Something like that. That's a really popular one. Like, low fertility is pretty popular, and generally, I kind of like it. It works out pretty well. It does a pretty good job of both differentiating them, giving those kind of species like a big like weakness, and it also explains how those short-lived races that just don't live as long and they're much more, I'm going to say, cockroachy, why those species are so prolific, because they can reproduce way faster and they grow up way faster, which is another benefit of that. Like, an elf takes 100 years to become an adult. Like, for the first 40 years, they're effectively a child. Like, they're just a small child for like the first 30-40 years of their lives. Fuck, man, that's a big investment. You have to protect and feed this child, like a child, for 50 years, whereas humans only have to do it for like 12, and then they start to become a teenager and they're, quote, more useful in a medieval feudal sense. Whereas for elves, they got to do that shit for like a half a century. And dwarves got to do it for like 35 years. You know, whatever it is. But one, that's a big investment, and that's a lot of time for a creature to spend as a weak, easily killed child. So maybe not as many members of that species actually make it to adulthood, because it's simply more difficult to become an adult elf because it takes way longer. Another one I kind of see is like weird reproduction, like that one. There basically aren't, like, dwarves don't have sex and gender. They don't have it at all. The way a new dwarf is created is they're carved out of stone by a dwarf artisan, and then they're given life by their god directly. And that's how you become an adult, or that's how you become a dwarf, or how a dwarf is born. And then, like, but then, like, okay, they're just like fully formed adults as soon as they're created. Like, what skill? Like, do they have intrinsic crafting skills? Like, are their skills their crafting skills are bestowed upon them by their god, and then they can learn some other things. And then, maybe they're crafted without beards. They're crafted. They're hairless because their bodies are made of, earth or whatever. But for them, and they're born hairless, and then they have to grow their beard. And when their beard is fully grown, that's when they're an adult, or just make up some bullshit that makes enough sense. And like, same thing with elves. Like, an individual elf is harvested from a tree that has to be cut down in order for an elf to be born. So it's like a big bittersweet thing that the elves have to do, and they're so like intrinsically tied to the forest that in order to bore a new elf, they have to cut down a 300-year-old tree. So that sucks. So there's like that's actually kind of interesting. Like, there's a big element of, you can wrap that up into like the Christian idea of original sin. Like, just to be born is to sin. That can be an interesting angle for a whole species, especially when you have other species that don't have this concept to contrast them against. That could be really interesting. Actually, just make a whole race based on that. That's super cool. But yeah, like, you can do something like that. Like, they're just born in different ways, so they're not analogous to humanity. Or another pretty simple concept is every mortal race has the same like rough amount of like life essence or soul or humanity or whatever you want to call it. That is like, that's their soul. But for humans, it's condensed and it burns much faster and brighter. And it burns out. And it burns out within like a century. But for dwarves and elves, it burns way slower. So like, it just takes dwarves and elves longer to do basically anything. For them to internalize concepts and skill sets, maybe it takes them a lot longer. Or just it takes them a little longer, but they can learn more things. A lot of different things. But maybe it's harder for them to be as intrinsically creative, or they can't learn like as many skill sets. Like, they'll get like a doctorate in one or two things, and then that's it. They're done. They can't learn anymore, which is weird. But or maybe humans just lack a lot of personality traits and ideals usually attributed to humans, like determination and bravery and all those good, noble bullshit things. all those other races just kind of lack. Like, elves are just kind of cowardly, but you have to paint that in a certain way, otherwise you have a whole race of cowards, and that's a really negative thing. So you got to be really careful with those kinds of concepts. So, you know, yeah, like maybe those long-lived races, they have the same amount of life. It's just stretched out. And then there's a lot of interesting complexities that can arise from that. Like, you know, because they, like, for example, if they spend, this isn't related to being stretched out, but if, you know, if an elf spends 100 years before they become an adult, that's a lot of time for school. So you could give elves and dwarves and other long-lived races maybe extra intelligence-based proficiencies, and they really have to be specifically intelligence-based. One, because mechanically those aren't super strong, and two, by tying them only to like intelligence proficiencies, it's because they have all this extra time to study before they're an adult. Or maybe child labor is really common with those species. Something like, you know, there's a lot of different directions you can go with a concept like that. But I definitely like the idea of longer lived races burning, like their soul burning slower and not as bright. Or maybe, for example, humans are actually condensed. Like, you know, elves and dwarves are the more natural form of life, but humans are like the condensed version that burns really fast and really hot, and that's why they reproduce so quickly and they do things so quickly, and they don't sit there deliberating for so long. Which actually, that's another wrinkle I see a lot. Like also with dragons, like because dragons live like 3,000 years, they take forever to decide on what to do. Like they'll sit there and they'll deliberate on something for centuries before they actually get up and go fucking do it, because it's just not urgent for them. And a lack of urgency, I think that probably I think that works pretty well for those long-lived races too. Like, they just don't need to get to it. They've got centuries to do it, whatever it is. Like, you know, a dwarven craftsman that has this pet project that's been in the back of his shop for fucking 100 years, and the last time he thought about it was 45 years ago. He's like, oh, I gotta work on that. And he went to the market and he got like this one specific type of metal that he needs for that project, and then he put it down somewhere, and that was 45 years ago. You know, simple things like that I think work pretty well. Or when it comes to like portraying that type of character, a really cool example I like is a snippet from Marvel Comics Thor. So he's an immortal being, so it's not exact, or a pseudo-immortal being, I don't know how, but he's like, and there's some differences between like an immortal individual and a long-lived individual, but there's enough of a crossover for the purpose of this topic that I can talk about it here. Like, there's one point where Thor goes back to the Avengers Tower, and he's talking to Steve Rogers, and he just kind of tells Steve how much he appreciates the Avengers and how much he appreciates him, because whenever Thor comes back to Earth, the Avengers are still there. They're not dead. They're not gone. They're consistent. They're still there. Because there's been so many times where Thor leaves a place and he comes back and everything is different. All the people he knew are gone. And he's only been gone like 5 years. But everybody's gone. Everybody's dead. It was like, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but it was like this concept. And a big part of it is the fact that Thor, because of how long-lived he is, the way a human might think of, they might remember, like, that Friday 3 weeks ago. What do you remember from that Friday 3 weeks ago? Like, you might remember, like, some bullet points for what you did for work that day. You might remember a particular meal if it was particularly, like, different. Like, maybe that was the first time you tried Indian food or whatever, so you'll remember that. Or maybe, you went out to the bar with some friends you haven't seen in a while, so you remember that. But otherwise, how many random Fridays do you remember? Not many. Like, you remember that there were Fridays, but you don't specifically remember them. And that's kind of how Thor remembers entire centuries of history. Like, he might remember, like, a snippet from a big battle he was in 400 years ago. But he doesn't remember, like, the decade